The cold, smooth surface of the gravestone seemed to mock her as she stood in front of it, barely able to keep her composure. The rain fell relentlessly as though the heavens themselves were mourning her decision. Yet, it wasn't the rain that chilled her to the bone, it was the thought that the man who had controlled every aspect of her life for so long had finally believed she was gone. Her name was Eleanor Westbrook. She had once been the epitome of grace and wealth, married to one of the most powerful men in the city, Jonathan Westbrook. To the world, they were the perfect couple, admired and envied by all who crossed their path. But behind the polished doors of their mansion, Eleanor's life was a prison. The marriage had started with passion, or so she had believed. Jonathan had charmed her with his intelligence, ambition, and ability to make her feel seen. But as the years passed, his affection turned to control. His love twisted into something darker, a suffocating force that stifled her every breath. His words cut deeper than any knife could, his actions more hurtful than she ever dared to admit to anyone. Eleanor had tried to leave once, but Jonathan's manipulation and threats kept her bound to him. He knew her weaknesses, her fears. Every time she thought of leaving, he would find a way to remind her how dependent she was on him. She had become a prisoner in her own home, her once vibrant spirit drained away by his cruelty. But tonight, standing before the gravestone that marked the end of her old life, Eleanor allowed herself a flicker of hope. She had done it. She had faked her own death. The funeral had been elaborate, tears had flowed, and the world believed she was gone. She had sent Jonathan a final letter, a farewell that would break his heart, leaving no questions behind. Her disappearance would be his punishment for the years of torment he had put her through. As the rain continued to pour, Eleanor wiped away the stray tear that threatened to fall. She had no intention of mourning the woman she had been. She was reborn, free from the man who had once owned her. She turned, walking away from the grave, her steps firm with the weight of her decision. It wasn't until she reached the edge of the cemetery that she heard the voice, a low, familiar growl that sent a shock of panic through her. Eleanor. Her heart skipped a beat, her breath freezing in her chest. She didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The voice was unmistakable, Jonathan. The man she had hoped to escape from forever. She felt her knees weaken, but she refused to let them give way. She couldn't show weakness now. I knew you wouldn't stay dead, he continued, stepping into the dim light of the street lamp. His face, once handsome, was now a mask of fury, his eyes dark with disbelief and rage. You think you can just disappear and I won't find you? Eleanor's mind raced. She had planned for everything, except for the one thing she had underestimated, Jonathan's obsessive need for control. You have no idea what you're doing, Eleanor, he spat, his voice trembling with the anger that had always simmered beneath his cool exterior. I will find you. No one leaves me. No one. Eleanor's pulse quickened. She knew she had to run, but she was already too exposed. The fact that he had found her so quickly meant one thing. He had been watching her, tracking her every move, waiting for the moment she would slip. As Jonathan advanced toward her, his long strides eating up the distance, Eleanor turned and fled, her footsteps pounding against the wet pavement. She didn't dare look back, afraid that if she did, he would already be there, his hands on her, pulling her back into the life she had just escaped. Her heart raced, and her breath came in desperate gasps as she darted between the gravestones, praying to stay ahead of him. The sound of his footsteps was a constant reminder that there was no real escape from the man she had married. She rounded a corner, heading toward the forest at the edge of the cemetery. She had planned to disappear into the wilderness, to find a way out of the city, to start over far away from everything she had known. But now she realized she had miscalculated. There was no escaping him. Jonathan would never let her go. The story continued with Eleanor's memories of her life before the escape. She recalled the first time she had met Jonathan. They had met at a lavish event, a gala thrown by one of Jonathan's business partners. She had been young, impressionable, swept off her feet by his charm. I love how you think, Eleanor, Jonathan had said on their first date. You're not like the others. You see things the way I do. At first she had believed in his words. He had made her feel special, as though she were the only person in the world who mattered. She had married him not out of obligation, but because she thought he truly cared for her. But over time, the gentle whispers of affection turned into demands, and the warmth of his embrace became suffocating. He controlled every part of her life, from the clothes she wore to the friends she kept. Whenever she would try to assert herself, Jonathan would find a way to remind her of her place. You wouldn't survive without me, he would tell her. I'm the only one who truly understands you. The first time he slapped her, Eleanor had been too stunned to react. The pain had been sharp, but it was the shame that lingered, making her believe she deserved it. Afterward, Jonathan had begged for her forgiveness, swearing it would never happen again. But it did. And the cycle continued for years: manipulation, violence, and empty promises. Eleanor felt trapped, isolated from the world, unable to find a way out. Every attempt to reach out to friends or family had been thwarted by Jonathan's lies. "They don't care about you," he would say. "I'm the only one who matters." It was during one of their many arguments that the idea had formed. Eleanor had been sitting in their grand, empty mansion, staring at the walls that seemed to close in on her. She had reached a breaking point, but she didn't know how to leave without risking her life. That's when she came up with a plan: a fake death. She would disappear completely and Jonathan would think he had won. The rain had not stopped. Eleanor's heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled through the dark forest, branches scraping her skin. Her mind was racing. Jonathan was still behind her. She could hear his voice, faint but persistent, calling her name in the distance. "I know you're out there, Eleanor. You can't run forever." Panic surged through her. She had to get to the car she had hidden in the forest, the one she'd arranged for a quick getaway. She couldn't afford to let him catch her. But as she reached the clearing, her heart sank. The car was gone. Eleanor froze, her breath hitching in her throat. The car, her carefully laid lifeline, was nowhere to be seen. Her mind reeled. Had Jonathan found it? Or had someone else? She glanced over her shoulder, the distant sound of Jonathan's voice cutting through the forest. "No," she whispered to herself, forcing her legs to move. She had to keep going. She couldn't stop now. She pushed through the trees, her shoes sinking into the soft mud. Each step felt heavier than the last, but she pressed on, adrenaline fueling her. Her mind raced with options. If the car was gone, she'd have to find another way out of the forest and onto the highway. But time was running out and Jonathan was relentless. The rain began to ease, but the forest remained dark, the thick canopy above blocking out the moonlight. Eleanor's thoughts were interrupted by a crack of a branch nearby. She froze, her body trembling. It wasn't Jonathan's voice this time, it was the sound of movement too deliberate to be an animal. "Keep going," she whispered to herself, barely audible. Her heart thudded as she pushed forward, brushing past low-hanging branches. Her thoughts spiraled. She had planned everything so carefully. The fake accident, the staged funeral, the cash hidden away in untraceable accounts. But none of it mattered if Jonathan caught her. As she moved deeper into the forest, a voice called out, closer this time. "You really thought you could outsmart me?" Jonathan's voice echoed, chilling and calm. "Did you really think I wouldn't find you, Eleanor?" Tears stung her eyes, but she didn't stop. She reached into her coat pocket, her fingers brushing against the small knife she had tucked away, a last resort. She didn't know if she could use it, but the thought gave her a sliver of courage. Eleanor had spent months crafting her escape, working in secret to ensure Jonathan wouldn't suspect a thing. It had started with small steps, diverting funds from their joint accounts into a private one he didn't know about, creating a false identity, and finding someone she could trust to help her. That person was Rachel, an old friend from college. They hadn't spoken in years, but Rachel's voice had been warm when Eleanor called. "You're telling me you want to disappear?" Rachel had asked, her tone laced with concern. "I have no choice," Eleanor admitted. "He'll never let me go otherwise." Rachel had hesitated but eventually agreed to help. Together they planned everything: the fake car accident, the obituary, and the escape route. Eleanor had left Rachel in charge of the final details, trusting her to make it look convincing. "Are you sure about this?" Rachel had asked one last time. "I have to be," Eleanor had replied, her voice firm. "This is the only way I'll ever be free." Eleanor's lungs burned as she ran, her body pushed to its limit. She had no idea how far she'd come, but she couldn't stop. The rain had turned to a light drizzle, and the forest was eerily silent except for the sound of her labored breathing. Suddenly she spotted a dim light in the distance. Hope flared in her chest. A cabin? A campsite? She moved toward it, her pace quickening despite her exhaustion. As she drew closer, she realized it wasn't a cabin but a parked car. An SUV with its headlights on, partially hidden behind a thicket of trees. Relief washed over her. She could use it to escape even if it meant breaking in. But as she stepped closer, her relief turned to dread. Standing beside the SUV was Rachel. And Jonathan. Eleanor stopped dead in her tracks, her heart shattering at the sight. Rachel's face was pale, her expression unreadable. Jonathan, on the other hand, looked triumphant, his lips curling into a smirk when he saw her. "Ah, there you are," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "I told you, Eleanor. No one leaves me. Eleanor's eyes darted between them, disbelief and betrayal crashing over her. Rachel? She whispered, her voice trembling. Rachel looked away, guilt written all over her face. I'm sorry, Eleanor, she murmured. He found me. I didn't have a choice. Eleanor's world crumbled. She had trusted Rachel, confided in her, relied on her. And now, the one person she thought she could count on had handed her back to the man she was trying to escape. Jonathan took a step forward, his presence commanding and menacing. You should have known better, he said, his tone mocking. You can't outsmart me, Eleanor. You never could. Eleanor's hand tightened around the knife in her pocket. She felt cornered, desperate, like a wild animal trapped with no way out. Her mind raced, searching for a way to turn the situation around. Rachel, she said, her voice steadying as she fought to regain control. You know what he's capable of. You've seen it. Don't do this. Don't let him win. Rachel hesitated, her eyes flickering with doubt. But before she could respond, Jonathan cut in. Enough of this, he snapped. Get in the car, Eleanor. We're going home. Eleanor's grip on the knife tightened. She couldn't go back. Not now. Not ever. No, she said, her voice firm despite the fear coursing through her. I'm not going anywhere with you. Jonathan's eyes darkened, his temper flaring. Don't make this harder than it has to be, Eleanor. You don't have a choice. But she did. Eleanor knew this was her moment, her chance to fight back. Her fingers tightened around the knife as she took a deep breath, preparing herself for what she had to do. I do have a choice, she said, her voice steady. And I choose freedom. Before Jonathan could react, Eleanor lunged. Time seemed to slow as Eleanor lunged forward, the knife flashing in her hand. She wasn't a fighter, and the weight of what she was doing crashed over her in an instant. But she knew she had no other choice. This was her moment, her only chance to escape Jonathan's clutches. Jonathan's reflexes were sharp, and he stepped back just in time to avoid the blade, his expression twisting into shock and fury. Eleanor, he roared, grabbing for her wrist. She twisted away, using all her strength to keep the knife out of his grasp. I'm not going back with you, she shouted, her voice breaking. Rachel stood frozen by the car, her hands trembling. Eleanor, stop, she cried. You're going to make it worse. But Eleanor wasn't listening. All the years of abuse, manipulation, and fear had built up into this moment. She refused to let him win again. Jonathan lunged at her, and they collided, the force sending both of them crashing to the muddy ground. The knife slipped from Eleanor's grasp, skidding out of reach. Jonathan pinned her down, his weight pressing on her chest, making it hard to breathe. You think you're brave now? He hissed, his face inches from hers. You're nothing without me. Nothing? Eleanor clawed at him, her nails raking across his face as she struggled beneath him. I'd rather die than live another day under your control. Jonathan's hand shot out, wrapping around her throat. His grip tightened, and Eleanor's vision began to blur. She kicked and thrashed, desperate to break free, but he was too strong. And then, suddenly, there was a loud thud. Jonathan's body went rigid, his grip loosening as his eyes widened in shock. Slowly, he slumped to the side, collapsing onto the ground beside Eleanor. Gasping for air, Eleanor rolled onto her side, clutching her throat. She looked up to see Rachel standing over them, a large tree branch in her hands. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and determination. I'm sorry, Rachel said, her voice trembling. I couldn't let him hurt you. Eleanor sat up, her body shaking. She glanced at Jonathan, who was unconscious but still breathing. Relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. They didn't have much time. We have to go, Eleanor said, her voice hoarse. Now. Rachel dropped the branch, nodding. Get in the car. I'll drive. The SUV roared to life as they sped away from the forest, the tires kicking up mud and gravel. Eleanor sat in the passenger seat, her hands trembling in her lap. She couldn't believe what had just happened. I thought you betrayed me, she said softly, her voice barely audible over the sound of the engine. Rachel glanced at her, guilt etched across her face. I almost did, she admitted. He found me a week ago. He threatened me, Eleanor. He said he'd ruin my life if I didn't help him find you. I didn't know what to do. You told him where I was, Eleanor said, her voice hardening. I didn't, Rachel insisted. Not at first. But he's persuasive. I thought if I brought him to you, it would end everything. But when I saw what he was about to do back there, she shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I couldn't let it happen. Eleanor stared out the window, her emotions a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and gratitude. You saved me, she said quietly. But we're not safe yet. He's going to come after us. Rachel tightened her grip on the steering wheel. Not if we disappear first. They drove for hours, leaving the forest and the city far behind. Eleanor directed Rachel to a storage unit she had rented under a false name, where she had stashed a backup supply of cash, clothes, and forged documents. Inside the dimly lit unit, Eleanor rummaged through the bags, pulling out a passport with her new identity, Margaret Ellis. It felt surreal holding it, knowing she was about to leave her old life behind for good. What's the plan now? Rachel asked, leaning against the wall. Eleanor glanced at her. You don't have to come with me, Rachel. This isn't your fight. Rachel shook her head. After what I've done, I can't go back to my old life. I'll help you whatever it takes. Eleanor hesitated but nodded. We head south. I know a place where we can lay low for a while. But we have to move fast. Jonathan won't stay down for long. Unbeknownst to them, Jonathan had already regained consciousness. Bleeding and furious, he pulled himself to his feet, his mind racing. He would not let Eleanor win. He wouldn't let her humiliate him like this. Pulling out his phone, he called his private investigator, a man who had been helping him track Eleanor for weeks. She's with Rachel, Jonathan growled. Find them. I don't care how much it costs. Just find them. The investigator's voice was calm and confident. Don't worry, Mr. Westbrook. They won't get far. Jonathan wiped the blood from his face, a sinister smile creeping onto his lips. Run all you want, Eleanor. You can't escape me. As Eleanor and Rachel crossed state lines, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that Jonathan was still out there, hunting her. But for the first time in years she felt a spark of hope. She wasn't the same woman who had endured years of abuse and manipulation. She was stronger now and she was determined to fight for her freedom, no matter what it took. And as the sun began to rise, casting a golden light over the horizon, Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. This wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please show your support by liking this video, share and subscribe to our channel. Also turn on the post notification bell so that you will be notified each time we post a story.